With wars that rage in parts of Africa, Asia, and Europe threatening to go global, and nations around the world staring at increasingly gloomier economic forecasts, the UN General Assembly heard Wednesday a briefing by the UN Secretary General on his plans and priorities for this year, and we bring you excerpts from that presentation.
Excellencies, for millions of people caught up in conflict around the world, life is a deadly, daily, hungry hell. Record numbers are fleeing their homes in search of safety, and they are crying out for peace, and we must hear them and act. In the immediate term, we must continue to push for peace across the globe. The situation in Gaza is a festering wound on our collective conscience that threatens the entire region. Nothing justifies the horrific terror attacks launched by Hamas against Israel on 7 October, nor is there any justification for the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Yet, Israeli military operations have resulted in destruction and death in Gaza at a scale and speed without parallel since I became Secretary General. And I'm especially alarmed by reports that the Israeli military intends to focus next on Rafah, where hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been squeezed in a desperate search for safety. Such an action would exponentially increase what is already a humanitarian nightmare with untold regional consequences. It's time for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. And this must rapidly lead to irreversible actions towards a two-state solution based on United Nations resolutions, international law, and previous agreements. In Ukraine, I repeat my call for a just and sustainable peace in line with UN Charter and international law for Ukraine, for Russia, and for the world. In a swath of countries across the Sahel, terrorism is spiking and civilians are paying a terrible price. We will not relent in supporting the people of the Sahel in these troubling times. Collective action is essential in the Horn of Africa to consolidate the hard-won gains against Al-Shabaab and to preserve the fundamental principle of territorial integrity, avoiding new crises. The fighting must stop in Sudan before it destroys even more lives and spreads. And in Libya, while a ceasefire holds, the Libyan people deserve sustained peace and stability, starting with a commitment to free and fair elections. In Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, I call on all armed groups to lay down their weapons, and I urge regional leaders to prioritize dialogue over conflict. In Yemen, I appeal to all parties to focus on the path to peace and also to de-escalate tensions in the Red Sea based on the principle of freedom of navigation. In Myanmar, we need sustained international and regional attention to help urgently forge a path towards a democratic transition and return to civilian rule. And in Haiti, lawlessness is surging and millions face acute food insecurity. The multinational security support mission must be deployed without delay, and I hope all obstacles will be removed. But I also urge member states to provide the necessary financial support. And in the Western Balkans, some leaders continue to stoke tensions and NATO-nationalistic rhetoric. I urge action for reconciliation, stability, and economic prosperity across the region. Excellencies, if countries fulfill their obligations under the Charter, every person's right to a life of peace and dignity would be guaranteed. But governments are ignoring and undermining the very tenets of multilateralism with zero accountability. The United Nations Security Council, the primary platform for questions of global peace, is deadlocked by geopolitical fissures. This is not the first time the Council has been divided, but it is the worst. Today's dysfunction is deeper and more dangerous. During the Cold War, Well-established mechanisms helped manage superpower relations. In today's multipolar world, such mechanisms are missing. And so our world is entering in an age of chaos. And we are seeing the result, a dangerous, unpredictable free-for-all with total impunity. Excellencies, beyond tensions in the world and within communities, we need peace with justice. Inequalities and injustice are fuel for a world at war with itself, and conflicts are stoking further inequalities and injustice. Take the tale of two canals. Trade via the Suez Canal is down by 42% since the start of Houthi attacks on shipping in the Red Sea more than 3 months ago. And trade via the Panama Canal is down 36% in the past months because of low water levels, a byproduct of the climate crisis. Whether the cause is conflict or climate, the result is the same: disruption to global supply chains and increased costs for everybody. And developing economies are particularly vulnerable to these disruptions. Sustainable, inclusive development hinges on peace. And delivering the Sustainable Development Goals is our most effective way of building peace and prosperity. Yet we face a development emergency. The seismic shock of the COVID-19 pandemic was followed by a sharp acceleration in global tensions and global prices when Russia invaded Ukraine. Developing economies were sent reeling. Many still are. Today's global economic outlook largely ignores the elephant in the room. Developing countries are experiencing their worst half-decade since the early 1990s. Many face unpayable debt service costs, which are now at record levels. The world's poorest countries will owe more in debt service this year than their public spending on health, education and infrastructure combined. And meanwhile, governments are being forced to cut back on investments and in social services. Excellencies, to keep the promise of the SDGs, we need progress in two crucial areas. First, finance. We are pushing for an SDG stimulus of $500 billion annually in affordable long-term finance for developing countries. The SDG stimulus calls for urgent action on debt, including breathing space for countries facing impossible repayment schedules. I have invited a small number of heads of state to work with me to make the stimulus a reality. With your support, we can significantly and immediately increase the capital and capacity of multilateral development banks and help get developing economies back on track. Positive steps have been taken by the leadership of the banks, but there is still a long way to go. And second, we must keep working to usher in a new Bretton Woods moment with an international financial architecture that responds to the needs of all countries. And today's architecture is outdated, dysfunctional, and unfair. It favors the rich countries that designed it nearly 8 years ago. It fails to offer countries the affordable finance required to meet our shared goals. And it does not fulfill the basic foundational function of providing a financial safety net for all developing countries. The Summit of the Future will consider the need for deep reforms to make financial institutions and frameworks truly universal and inclusive.
From New York, for KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.